The morning sunlight spilled across the glass towers of New York City as cameras whirred to life inside the Good Morning America studio. Producers rushed about, adjusting lights and whispering final instructions into headsets. On this particular day, the show's energy felt sharper, more charged than usual. The audience seats were filled with an eager crowd waiting to see a Hollywood icon, Helen Mirren, the Academy Award-winning actress known for her regal poise and biting wit. Helen had been booked to promote her upcoming historical drama, but her appearance was already making waves behind the scenes. George Stephanopoulos, the seasoned anchor who had sparred with politicians, authors, and celebrities alike, was privately uneasy. He knew Helen's reputation: charming, elegant, but unafraid to challenge anyone she felt was being dismissive or condescending. As the countdown hit 0, the broadcast went live. "Good morning, America. We are thrilled to welcome the legendary Dame Helen Mirren," George announced with his trademark smile. The audience erupted in applause, and Helen walked onto the set, dressed in a striking emerald green dress, her silver hair perfectly styled. She waved gracefully, but her eyes flickered with the same sharp intelligence that had carried her through decades of demanding roles. She sat down opposite George, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. The first few questions were light, predictable, the kind meant to warm up the audience. Helen spoke about the film's costumes, the director's vision, and the challenges of portraying powerful women from history. But George, perhaps emboldened by his years as a political journalist, shifted the conversation in a way Helen hadn't expected. "So Helen," George began, leaning forward, "a lot of critics say your new film glorifies outdated power structures, celebrating monarchy and hierarchy in a time when society is trying to move forward. Do you think that's responsible storytelling?" The audience fell silent. Helen's lips curved into a half-smile, but there was steel in her tone as she replied. "Well, George, art isn't supposed to comfort everyone's ideology. It's supposed to provoke thought. History doesn't bend itself to modern sensitivities just because we wish it would. My job as an actress is to reveal the humanity in these figures, not to sanitize them for present-day politics." A ripple of applause came from the studio audience. George's smile tightened. "Yes, but don't you think Hollywood has a duty not to romanticize figures of privilege while ignoring the suffering they caused?" he pressed. Helen's eyes narrowed slightly. "George, if we start judging every story by today's political yardstick, we'd erase half of Shakespeare, most of Dickens, and nearly all of world history. Art is not propaganda. If you want propaganda, watch campaign ads." The audience laughed nervously, sensing the rising tension. George straightened his tie, clearly irritated. "But isn't it fair to say that as someone with influence, you should be mindful of the message you're sending?" Helen leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with deliberate calm. "And isn't it fair to say, George, that as someone with influence, you should be mindful not to reduce art to soundbites for political convenience?" The air in the studio grew thick. Producers shifted uncomfortably in the control room. One whispered, "She's going off script, do we cut to commercial?" But the cameras kept rolling. George tried to recover. "So you don't believe actors have any responsibility to society?" Helen's voice rose slightly, her tone carrying the authority of a queen addressing a disobedient subject. "Actors are responsible for truth in their craft, not for coddling the public. We hold a mirror up to life. Sometimes people don't like what they see. That's not our fault." The audience applauded more loudly now, clearly siding with Helen. George's jaw tightened as he attempted to steer the conversation back to neutral ground. But Helen wasn't finished. "You know, George," she said with a piercing look, "it's fascinating. You've grilled presidents with more kindness than you're showing me right now. Why is that? Is it easier to patronize an actress than to challenge a politician?" The crowd gasped audibly. The comment hit hard, echoing through the studio. George opened his mouth, but no words came out immediately. The director in the control room slammed a button. "Go to break. Now." The screen faded to commercials, but inside the studio, the clash was far from over. George leaned toward Helen, his voice low but sharp. That was completely out of line. Helen, unbothered, sipped from her water glass. "No, George. That was completely honest. And honesty always feels uncomfortable to the one trying to control the narrative." The crew scurried around, pretending not to listen, but every ear was tuned in. The producers exchanged frantic glances, unsure of how to salvage the segment. When the cameras came back live, the tension hadn't cooled. Helen smiled serenely at the audience, but George's face betrayed his frustration. The conversation limped forward for a few more questions until Helen delivered one final, devastating line. "I came here to talk about art, George, not to be lectured about politics. If this is what Good Morning America has become, then perhaps I shouldn't have come at all." The audience gasped again. The producers immediately cut to weather, while studio security discreetly moved toward Helen's side of the stage. Within moments, whispers spread across the set. Helen Mirren was being escorted out. As the cameras shifted away, Helen stood, shook the hand of the meteorologist with a warm smile, and walked off, leaving George pale and visibly rattled. The live studio audience erupted into chatter, their phones already out, recording every second. By the time the show ended, clips of the clash had already begun circulating online. The words, "Helen Mirren destroys George Stephanopoulos," trended on social media before noon. But this was only the beginning. The fallout from Helen Mirren's abrupt exit was immediate and explosive. Within an hour of the live broadcast, every major news outlet replayed the footage on loop. Social media lit up with hashtags, #Helen vs George, #Team Helen, and #GMA Clash. Clips of her fiery exchange with George spread across TikTok and X, gathering millions of views within hours. One user wrote, "Helen Mirren just schooled George Stephanopoulos harder than any politician ever has." Another quipped, "She didn't just spill the tea, she poured the whole pot on live TV." The network in crisis. At ABC headquarters, executives were in panic mode. Emails flew back and forth with subject lines like, "Crisis containment, Mirren incident." The PR team debated whether to issue a statement condemning Helen's remarks or to downplay the clash's spirited conversation. George, meanwhile, sat in his office, staring at his phone as messages from colleagues poured in. Some expressed sympathy, others congratulated him for standing his ground, but the overwhelming tide of public opinion seemed to favor Helen. The clip of her accusing him of treating politicians more gently than her had become the soundbite of the day. "George, we need to talk about optics," a senior producer said, stepping into his office. "Right now, it looks like you tried to lecture Dame Helen Mirren and got torched on your own show. People love her. They're not going to forgive us if we spin this the wrong way." George sighed, rubbing his temples. "She went too far. She disrespected me and the show." Or, the producer countered, "She exposed exactly what people think of mainstream media, and that's why the internet is eating it up." Helen speaks out. That afternoon, Helen broke her silence. She appeared on her Instagram account, sitting in her dressing room with a cup of tea in hand. Her tone was calm, but her words cut through the noise. "I want to clarify something," she began. "This morning, I was invited to talk about art, film, and history. Instead, I was scolded about politics. I believe journalists should ask hard questions, yes, but respect is a two-way street. I will never apologize for defending the role of art in society, nor for speaking truthfully, even when it makes people uncomfortable." Within minutes, her video had over 1 million likes and tens of thousands of supportive comments. Fellow actors chimed in. Viola Davis, "Queen behavior. Nothing but respect." Ian McKellen, "Helen has spoken for all of us who value art over agenda." Margot Robbie, "She said what needed to be said." Helen had turned what could have been a humiliating scandal into a defining moment of cultural debate. George under fire. By the evening news cycle, the narrative shifted. Pundits dissected every second of the interview. Some accused George of arrogance, saying he underestimated Helen's intellect. Others claimed Helen had been too combative. But the majority agreed on one thing. The clash had revealed the uneasy relationship between art, politics, and media. A satirical late-night host joked, George Stephanopoulos thought he was interviewing an actress. Turns out, he was interviewing a lioness. Ratings for Good Morning America spiked the next day, but not in the way George wanted. Viewers tuned in expecting more fireworks. Instead, George delivered a carefully scripted apology. "Yesterday, my conversation with Dame Helen Mirren became heated. While I stand by asking difficult questions, I regret if the tone came across as disrespectful. Helen is a legend, and we wish her the best." The apology was clipped and replayed everywhere, but many criticized it as hollow. Helen's next move. 2 days later, Helen made a surprise appearance on a rival network's morning show, CBS Mornings, where she was welcomed with open arms. Gayle King introduced her with warmth. "Dame Helen, we are honored to have you here, and let me just say, we promise to actually talk about your film." Helen laughed, and the audience applauded thunderously. This appearance cemented her status as the victor in the feud. CBS even leaned into the moment, jokingly calling her the Queen of Morning Television. Public reaction. Public opinion was now firmly split into two camps. Hashtag Team Helen, who praised her courage to confront George and defend artistic integrity. Hashtag Team George, a smaller but vocal group arguing that Helen overreacted and turned a serious question into personal criticism. But the numbers didn't lie. Polls showed 72% of viewers sided with Helen. The long-term impact. Over the following weeks, the clash became a case study in media circles. Universities analyzed the moment as an example of generational differences in communication, Helen's unapologetic authenticity versus George's polished but rigid style. Helen's film, ironically, benefited the most. Ticket pre-sales skyrocketed, with fans calling it the movie George didn't want us to see. The studio quietly thanked George Stephanopoulos in their marketing meetings, joking that his tough questioning had given them millions in free publicity. A chance encounter. Months later, Helen and George crossed paths at a charity gala in Los Angeles. Cameras weren't rolling this time, but onlookers couldn't help but watch as the two exchanged words. George approached cautiously. "Helen, I want to say again, I never meant to disrespect you." Helen regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled faintly. "George, let's call it what it was. You underestimated me. But don't worry, you won't make that mistake again." She raised her glass, clinked his, and walked away with the same regal grace she carried everywhere. George stood frozen, realizing she was right. That single interview had changed not only his reputation but his understanding of what it meant to face someone who refused to be diminished. Epilogue. In the end, Helen Mirren wasn't just kicked off a morning show. She kicked down the very walls of how celebrity interviews were supposed to go. She reminded millions that art is not political propaganda, and that even in an era of spin and soundbites, authenticity still had power. And George, he never forgot that morning when Dame Helen Mirren, with a single sharp glance and sharper words, turned Good Morning America into the most talked about show of the year.